What's up, everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of Brewing with 50 Bucks. This is the show where we take your favorite commanders, we slap on a $50 budget, and not only do we make a deck that is functional, but one that is also able to win you the game. My name is Stefan. I'm coming to you from the General Warfare headquarters. Glad you could join us today. So, a bit of dirty laundry from last week. Yes, I postponed it to this week, and next week I will also have a new video out for you, just so I can make my quota for July as well. That out of the way, this month also was the release of Double Masters 2022. And as you know already from the last couple of weeks of it being out, there is a myriad of new reprints and commanders that have just gotten the necessary reprints for budgetary reasons and for affordability reasons for a lot of commanders. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the 8th most popular commander from Double Masters. Keep in mind, it's not going to be Muldrotha. It's not going to be Muldrotha, and it's not going to be Kalia. Today's Brewing with 50 Bucks episode is Aminatou the Fateshifter. So, I wanted to give myself a little bit of a challenge since it's been a little while since I also made an Esper deck. And Aminatou has always been one of those commanders that always intrigued me, since their abilities are pretty good, and lends itself to very versatile ways that you can build it. Plus, it being the 8th most popular commander from Double Masters 2020, I figured it would be just a no-brainer for me to actually participate and give my 2 cents on how to build this. Now, overall, Aminatou seems like a great commander to use with an excellent color combination for control. Esper is always been known for as control colors and has been always known to have a very big deciding factor on how games generally come out and generally work. And with that, I'm going to start rambling on this. I'm going to take a look at Aminatou with the commander breakdown and the deck strategy of this deck. So, Aminatou the Fateshifter is a 3 loyalty planeswalker for white, blue, and black. So, for single Esper colors, legendary planeswalker Aminatou. Its first ability is a +1 loyalty where you could draw a card, then put a card from your hand on top of your library. Its -1 loyalty is exile another target permanent you own, then return it to the battlefield under your control. And the -6 ultimate ability is choose left or right. Each player gains control of all non-land permanents other than Aminatou the Fateshifter, controlled by the next player in the chosen direction. Aminatou the Fateshifter can be your commander. So, obviously speaking, the Aminatou lends itself to many different themes, whether it be with Bling, whether it be Fate Seal, or anything regarding the such. And with the color combination of white, blue, and black, those are control colors. So, a lot of what this deck's going to be doing is controlling the board, but our main deck strategy with this deck is to play a bunch of our enter the battlefield creatures on the field, play Aminatou afterwards, and then profit off all the blink you'll be doing within the game. And as always, we make these decks with a $50 budget in mind, which includes the price of the commander, which excludes the price of the basic lands, and we also offer a $5 overage compromise. So this deck can be built for $50 on the mark. The compromise is available for those who can spare the extra $5 to add some extra cool cards in here. You can find the deck list of this deck in the show notes down below, and if I can ask of one small favor for you guys, please consider liking this video, sharing amongst your playgroup and your Magic the Gathering friends, subscribing to the channel, and hit that bell icon to be notified of every future video that comes out of this channel. Thank you very much. So with the deck, we're going to be taking a look at this deck through the standard array of categories, which will include our artifacts, our enchantments, our lands, our sorceries, our planeswalkers, our creatures, and our instants. And with these videos, we like to start with the most cumbersome of categories, but don't fret if there's one area you want to look at most. We have chapters for each one of our videos, so that way you can skim through each of the videos and find which area you want to start off with. Let's start off with our creatures, the most cumbersome of our categories. We are running roughly 26 creatures in this deck, which is almost 1/3 of our deck devoted to creatures in this way. Starting off, we have Ashen Rider. Now, a 8-mana creature is usually something that you don't want to start off your deck with, but with Ashen Rider, this is actually a really good creature, as whenever it enters the battlefield or it dies, you exile target permanent. Now, getting rid of a permanent, just destroying it basically is always good, but exiling it and removing it from the game permanently is always better. Now, obviously it being a 5/5 flying for 8 mana is kind of limited, because it only limits itself to only 5 mana, but that exile ability on its enter the battlefield or dying ability makes up for that extra 3 mana automatically. Brago King Eternal is next, and this is going to be one of the key players in our game here, as Brago is one of the more popular blink commanders in the game and in the format of commander. But with whenever Brago deals combat damage to a player, you exile any number of targeted non-land permanents you control, then return those cards to the battlefield under your control. So effectively, Brago is going to allow us to blink all of our creatures and get some extra enter the battlefield triggers off them. So we want to make sure that Brago stays on the field as much as possible and that we get multiple blink effects and enter the battlefield triggers off him. Callous Blood Mage is next. This is a card all the way from Strixhaven. So whenever it enters the battlefield, you get to choose one of 3, where you create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with when this creature dies, you gain 1 life. You can also draw a card and lose 1 life, or you exile target player's graveyard. Now, given most of the time you're going to be taking that card draw ability and at the cost of 1 life, an extra pest is not too bad. That exile target player's graveyard is just very petty. And it will immediately lock out somebody from the game, especially if they're using graveyard synergies. Charming Prince is next. This is one all the way from Throne of Eldraine, and when it enters the battlefield, you either get to scry 2, you gain 3 life, or you exile another target creature you control and then return to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next end step. So you can even just blink Charming Prince to just blink another creature and start a domino effect of just constant blinking. And this is just really, really good, as whenever Aminatou uses their minus ability, or whenever you have other cards that allow you to blink to Charming Prince, you can easily get the domino effect starting and you get the ball rolling, basically. Cloud Blazer is next, a flying creature for 5 mana, a 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, gain 2 life and draw 2 cards. Amazing card for any blink deck, and it's an automatic include, as that 2 life and those extra 2 cards are always worth it, especially if it's a little steep to cast it for 5 mana. But whenever you're playing a blink deck with multiple instances of blinking creatures, Cloud Blazer is obviously going to be number 1 choice here. Now, Corpse Knight is next, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life. So this is actually an infinite combo in our deck, and we'll actually be getting to the next card very, very soon. But to go over Corpse Knight a little bit, basically whenever you're blinking your creatures, basically all your opponents are going to be losing some life off it. And why not drain your opponents whenever you're getting it to do the fun stuff? Diluvian Primordial is next, and when it enters the battlefield, for each opponent, you may cast up to 1 target instant or sorcery card from that player's graveyard without paying the mana cost. And if a spell cast this way would be put into a graveyard this turn, you exile it instead. So for each one of your players, basically if you're running a 4-player pod, you get to exile up to 3 instants or sorcery cards your opponents already played this turn, and some of them could be very big bombs, as you could be casting some great stuff like recurring your creatures, or even just destroying the board and getting rid of some problematic creatures. Diluvian Primordial is going to be an automatic include, especially in a blink deck where you get to exile every single instant sorcery out of your opponent's graveyards. It's fantastic. Now Felidar Guardian is next, and when it enters the battlefield, you may exile another target permanent you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. And this is the infinite combo I was just alluding to with Corpse Knight. So this combo is actually an infinite life loss and infinite enter the battlefield and leave the battlefield. So this combo actually requires all permanents to be on the battlefield. So first, how you get the ball rolling is you activate Aminatou's second ability to exile another target permanent you own and then return to the battlefield. So with that, you're blinking the Felidar Guardian. Felidar Guardian will enter the battlefield, which will trigger the Corpse Knight and the Felidar Guardian. First, you want to resolve Corpse Knight to cause each opponent to lose 1 life, and then you resolve the Felidar Guardian's ability trigger to blink Aminatou. When Aminatou blinks, they'll be able to use their loyalty ability again. So you have a constant loop where you're just going to be blinking the Felidar Guardian and Aminatou the Fateshifter, and each opponent will be losing an infinite amount of life, and you will be winning the game. But you have other ways to use it, especially if you want to blink Diluvian Primordial, or if you want to blink the Callous Blood Mage or Charting Prince, or any one of the cards that we'll be getting to in the next little bit. So Felidar Guardian is well worth the price in this deck. Glorious Protector is next, and it has Flash, which is one of my absolute favorite abilities in Magic, where you can play stuff at instant speed. flying for a 4/4, and whenever it enters the battlefield, you may exile any number of non-angel creatures you control until Glorious Protector leaves the battlefield. And it also has Foretell. So Foretell is actually a mechanic that was created back all the way in Kaldheim, where you can exile a card for 2 mana and then pay for its Foretell cost at a later turn. With this, Glorious Protector actually protects a lot of your creatures if they're about to go bye-bye from a board wipe, or if somebody's going to automatically try to kill it. You can just flash in the Glorious Protector and save your creatures. That way, Glorious Protector will die first and your creatures will remain safe. The best of all of that is that when the Glorious Protector dies, all the creatures that you've already exiled with it will come back into play, and their enter the battlefield abilities will trigger off it. Gonti, Lord of Luxury is next, and when it enters the battlefield, you get to look at the top 4 cards of target opponent's library. You exile one of them face down and then put the rest at the bottom of that library in a random order. And for as long as this card remains exiled, you can look at it and you can cast it and spend mana as though it were mana of any type to cast it. Obviously speaking, Gonti allows you to just Fate Seal your opponents. Not only that, but exile a card that you think is worth it so that you can play at a later point in the game. And with constant blinking, you can even just exile a myriad amount of cards from your opponent's decks and be able to use it against them in the long run. Grey Merchant of Asphodel is next. Gary is one of the strongest cards in our deck, as whenever it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses X life, where X is the amount of devotion to black that we have, and we gain equal amount of life lost in that way. So Gary itself has only two loyalty. The loyalty is representative of each black mana symbol that you have. We have an amazing amount of life loss that we can regenerate on our opponents. That way we're going to be getting a lot of life back, and we're going to be putting our opponents at a more profitable life total for us to kill them in future turns. Meteor Golem is next, and this is just an automatic staple for any deck that wants to blink creatures and destroy permanents. So whenever it enters the battlefield, you could just destroy a target non-land permanent an opponent controls. Blinking Meteor Golem will mean the end for your opponents, as anytime you're blinking Meteor Golem, basically it'll just come back and keep destroying non-land permanents your opponents keep trying to cast. Mist Meadow Witch is next, and this is one of our other ways to start blinking stuff next to Brago and next to Aminatou. For 4 mana, you get to exile a creature and then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. It is a little limited, as you have to wait till the end step for your creature to come back into play, and your opponents may have some responses to that. But the fact that you still have the ability to blink your creatures at instant speed, if you'd like, even protects itself, since it doesn't say to exile another target creature. It says target creature. It can protect itself, and it can protect any other creature that you have that is vulnerable to a kill spell. Noxious Gearhulk is next, and speaking of kill spells, whenever it enters the battlefield, you get to destroy another target creature, and if it was destroyed, you gain life equal to its toughness. And the cool thing about it, it has Menace. So Menace allows you to swing in, and your opponents can't block unless they have 2 or more creatures that can block it. Now, blinking Noxious Gearhulk will just allow you to gain a massive amount of life, especially if you're going to be destroying a lot of creatures this way. And if they have a large toughness, you're going to be getting a lot of life back with the Gearhulk itself. Pilgrim's Eye is next, allowing you to search your library for a basic land and put it into your hand when it enters the battlefield. Flickering this allows you to get some extra momentum when it comes to land drops, and if you are pretty mana screwed, this is going to be a helpful way for you to get back online with some needed land drops. Raynar the Ever Watchful is next. This is quite a synergistic piece in our deck, where it has Flying and Vigilance for 4 mana, a 2/3. The first card you foretell each turn costs 0 to foretell, which is not exactly relevant in our deck. The second part of this is quite relevant though, as whenever you exile 1 or more cards from your hand and or permanents from your battlefield, you create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. So considering we're a blink deck, the more and more you blink your creatures, the more spirits are going to be coming out onto the field, and Raynar is just going to be pooping out a massive amount of spirits, so that way you have bodies in the event of your opponents trying to swing into you. You have the ability to go wide with Raynar as long as you have enough resources and enough spells to blink your creatures. Ravenous Chupacabra is next. And with this, it's another destroy target creature an opponent controls whenever it enters the battlefield for 4 mana. With this, like I mentioned before with the Noxious Gearhulk, you can just be blinking the Chupacabra a number of times and destroy your opponent's field, so that way you can start swinging in for big. Restoration Angel is next. Flash flying for 4 mana, and when it enters the battlefield, you can exile target non-angel creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under your control. It's very similar to what we were looking at before with Glorious Protector, except with this, you just exile 1 target non-angel creature, and it doesn't actually protect it from anything, it just blinks it out of the way. But Restoration Angel is obviously a good include to add in any blink deck as it stands. So Restoration Angel allows you to blink your creatures and get those extra into the battlefield abilities to trigger on your turn or at any point throughout the game. Seagate Oracle is next, and you get to look at the top 2 cards whenever they enter the battlefield of your library and put one of them into your hand and the other onto the bottom of your library. With this, you get to filter through your deck and you get to filter out all the cards you don't need and all the cards you do need for you to cast and to play. So Seagate Oracle is pretty strong in the sense that you get to filter through your deck and you get to choose all the cards that are necessary for you in that moment to keep. Sepulchral Primordial is coming up next, with this having Intimidate and is a 5/4 for 7 mana, but when it enters the battlefield, for each opponent you may put up to 1 target creature card from that player's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So in the same vein as Diluvian Primordial, you get to resurrect up to 3 of your opponent's creatures. And with the fact that a lot of your opponents could have some very, very strong creatures and some very game-winning stuff, it's a good idea to keep something that can reanimate your opponent's creatures and plot them against their own masters. Solemn Simulacrum is next. This is an automatic include in this deck, as this allows you to get some lands onto the battlefield, some basic lands on the battlefield, I should say, when it enters the battlefield, and whenever it dies, you can draw a card. The land drops that Solemn Simulacrum allows you to get anytime it blinks is going to be very amazing, as this color combination, I'm going to explain it a little bit more in detail in the pros and cons, but these colors are not very friendly when it comes to making your land drops or ramping in general. So the best what we can do right now is using Solemn Simulacrum and Pilgrim's Eye to get us some needed ramp in this deck. Soul Herder is next, and this is also a really good card to add on top of our blink strategy, as at the beginning of your end step, you can exile another target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under your owner's control. With that, you can blink as many of your creatures as you can at the end step, kind of akin to Conjurer's Closet in that sense. But with this, whenever a creature is exiled from the battlefield as well, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Soul Herder. So this Soul Herder could actually get very massive, and the fact that you have an end step ability to blink your creatures is just all the better, as you're going to get an extra enter the battlefield ability on your end step, and just to cap off the end of your turn going into whatever your opponents have to deal with on their turn. Spirited Companion is next, a 2 mana doggo 1/1, where whenever it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. Just easy enough for us to draw some extra cards in the event that we need that extra card draw to blink and to draw, if you don't have already the Cloud Blazer or any other ways to draw cards. This is just an easy and inexpensive way to get you there and get some extra cards in your hand. Stonehorde Dignitary is next, and this is just one of our meme cards that we're adding in here. A 4 mana 1/4 that whenever it enters the battlefield, target opponent skips the next combat phase. So if you have a very aggressive opponent and one who is actually very, very keen on combat, especially one you may have pissed off, you can always just keep blinking Stonehorde Dignitary to lock them out of combat for as long as you have the Stonehorde Dignitary, and the fact that you can keep stacking it on your turn, just constantly blink it and keep targeting the same opponents, they won't be able to attack you. And the fact that they will be able to attack, they can't really interact during combat, and they won't be able to get to you for possible commander damage or for some life-threatening combat damage. Sun Titan is next, and this allows you to return target permanents with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield whenever it enters the battlefield or whenever it attacks. So even if you're doing this on the same turn, you can even attack with Sun Titan and then blink it to get 2 cards with mana value 3 or less back to the battlefield. And the fact that Sun Titan allows you to recur your creatures, your permanents, basically, is going to be very sweet. Especially the fact if you're running low on stuff and you need some extra recursion, Sun Titan is there for you. The last of our creatures we're going to be talking about in today's video is Venser's Shaper Savant. I am so happy Venser went down in price, as we are now able to play it. Though it has Flash, it is a 4 mana 2/2, and when it enters the battlefield, you return target spell or permanent to its owner's hand. So this way you can actually also block your opponents from casting Cyclonic Rifts or just generally targeting your stuff. You can Flash Investor, bounce it to their hand, and that way they will have to wait a turn, or if a creature is coming your way or anything of the sort, you could just bounce them off the battlefield, and you have an extra body for you to cast and even blink as well, just to reprimand your opponents. Next category we're getting into is our Instants. We're running 20 Instants in this deck, which is about a fifth of our deck in and of itself. And with this, we want, especially with a blink deck, we want fast interaction, whether it be fast interaction with our opponents or fast interaction for us to blink our creatures. We want that interaction. That way we're going to be on the ball, and we're going to be on top of our game when it comes to blinking and getting our strategy up there. First off is Cloud Shift. For 1 mana, you exile target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under your control. Easy enough, it's a 1 mana blink spell, and this will allow you to just basically fizzle out your opponent's kill spells or anything targeting your creatures. In any case, you could just Cloud Shift them away, and then they come back with their enter the battlefield abilities, and you run wild with that. Counterspell, the original counterspell is next. 2 blue mana for an instant to counter target spell. What more can you ask for but simplicity? Crib Swap is next, a 3 mana instant speed kill spell that exiles target creature, and its controller creates a 1/1 colorless shapeshifter creature token with Changeling. Now with this, easy enough, you're permanently removing a creature from the game itself, and you're giving your opponent a 1/1 shapeshifter. But the fact it permanently gets rid of them, not destroy, exile, it's actually so much better in this case, as basically for 3 mana, you're getting rid of something immediately, and you won't have to deal with it for the rest of the game, unless they're running something like Rift Sweeper, where they can get it back from exile. But not many people in my playgroup run Rift Sweeper, and Rift Sweeper is a very few and far between card to add, just to get one thing back from exile. Despark is next. This is just an automatic include for any deck that has white and black in its color combination. Basically, to an instant speed exile permanent with mana value 4 or greater. It's easy enough to get rid of somebody's commander, and easy enough to get rid of somebody's big win con. And so that's why we're adding it in this deck. Displace is next, a 3 mana blink ability that allows you to exile up to 2 target creatures you control, then return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control. So where Cloud Shift allows you to blink 1 thing, Displace allows you to blink 2, and that way you're gonna get 2 edge of the battlefield triggers right off the bat. Eerie Interlude is next. This is one of our more expensive blink cards in this deck, though this yields great succession, as in the event of a board wipe, you could play this to exile any number of target creatures you control, and then return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So if someone's trying to wipe your field, you could just play Eerie Interlude to blink all your creatures, get them off the board, that way they won't be killed, and whenever they come back to the field, all those enter the battlefield abilities will trigger one after the other, so that way you're getting value off somebody trying to kill your stuff. Ephemerate is next, and this is a copy paste of Cloud Shift, but it also has the ability to rebound. So rebound basically reads, if you cast a spell from your hand, you exile it as it resolves, and at the beginning of your next upkeep, you could cast this card from exile without paying that mana cost. So you can actually just play Ephemerate, and then on your upkeep, you can just recast Ephemerate to blink something else, and then Ephemerate goes away afterwards. It's a 2-time use, but it was really good, especially for a 1 mana blink spell. Essence Scatter is next, a 2 mana counter spell that counters target creature spells at instant speed. Flicker of Fate is next. It's a 2 mana blink spell where you get to blink a creature or enchantment, return to the battlefield under its owner's control. Fracture is next, where you get to destroy a target artifact, enchantment, or planeswalker. That way you keep your opponents on their toes, and you get to destroy one of their big, scary permanents that are non-creature permanents, non-creature, non-land permanents. Generous Gift is next, and say it with me if you know it already. Destroy target permanent, its controller creates a 3/3 green elephant creature token. Ghostly Flicker is next. 3 mana to exile either 2 target artifacts, creatures, and or lands you control, then return those cards out to the battlefield under control. So basically, you not only get to have the option to choose creatures, but you can also choose artifacts and lands. So you can even blink your lands to untap them if they're tapping from multiple colors. and the fact that Ghostly Flicker allows you to blink your creatures, and even you can save your artifacts too if they're about to go bye-bye. Lae'zel's Acrobatics is next, and with this you get to exile all non-token creatures you control, then roll a d20. This is one of the new cards from actually Battle for Baldur's Gate. But with this, if you roll a 1 to 9, you return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. And then if you roll a 10 to 20, you return those cards to the battlefield under your control, then exile them again. Return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So this has the possibility of of double blinking your creatures. So you can actually just blink all your stuff for 4 mana, save all your creatures. And then if you roll high enough, you can actually blink them again for them to trigger a secondary time. This is actually a really fun card. It's 4 mana, but the fact that you have the possibility of doing a double blink with this card is absolutely amazing. Momentary Blink is next. 2 mana to exile target creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. And it has the flashback cost of 3 and a blue, where you can cast this card from your graveyard for its flashback cost, then exile it afterwards. Mortify is next, allowing you to destroy target creature or enchantment. This is pretty straightforward when it comes to enchantment and creature removal. Saw It Coming is our last counterspell in this deck, where you get to foretell it for 2 mana, or you get for 3 mana, you counter target spell. Semester's End is next, and I decided to add this card as this is just a really fun card to really add in a deck that's all about blinking, where you exile any number of target creatures and or planeswalkers you control. At the beginning of the next end step, you return each of them to the battlefield under its owner's control, but each of them enter the battlefield with either an additional +1/+1 counter on it if it's a creature, or an additional loyalty counter on it if it's a planeswalker. So this allows you to also blink Aminatou, so that way you can protect your planeswalker, and whenever Aminatou comes back into play, you have an additional loyalty counter to expend or use at your own desire. Teferi's Time Twist is next. You get to exile a target permanent you control and return it to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next end step. And if the blinked permanent was a creature, it enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. Utter End is next, and 4 mana to exile a target non-land permanent is just pretty straightforward. And lastly, Wash Away is next. This is the final of our counter spells in this deck, where for 1 blue mana you get to counter target spell that wasn't cast from their owner's hand, or you could cleave it for 3 mana and just counter target spell. But Wash Away for 1 mana allows you to counter commanders coming from the command zone, so keep that in mind. The cleave cost basically factors into an extra counter spell to counter a spell in general. Now, coming off our 2 most cumbersome categories, our next category is actually going to be our sorceries. And with that, we're only running 8 sorceries. So a bit of a drop in terms of how many cards that we're going to be looking at in categories, but like I said, most of our deck, about 46 of our 100 cards is dedicated to blinking and instant speed interactions. So this is the part of it where we take it a little bit slower. Starting off with Approach of the Second Sun, I've always loved adding this card to all my decks, all my white decks, as this is just an extra win con basically. But basically, if this spell was cast from your hand and you cast another spell named Approach of the Second Sun this game, you win the game. Otherwise, put Approach into this owner's library 7th from the top and you gain 7 life. So automatically saying you can actually just approach to the Second Sun twice and then win the game, but you have to make sure you cast it, or you basically just shuffle it, not even shuffle it, you put it 7th from the top and you gain some extra life on top of it. Most people, once you play Approach, will be targeting you, especially the fact that Aminatou allows you to draw extra cards, and with the amount of card draw that we have off our creatures, it's going to be insane to not think that we're going to be a threat, especially after playing Approach of the Second Sun. Austere Command is next. This is budget enough for me to finally play in one of these decks, so we're going to take full advantage of it. A 6 mana sorcery spell that allows you to destroy up to 2 of these. You either destroy all artifacts, all enchantments, all creatures with mana value 3 or less, or all creatures with mana value 4 or greater. So with Austere Command, you get to choose all the non-land permanents that you want to destroy, and you get to enact it especially super well, as you get to choose what's the scariest for you on your side of the board, and you just eradicate whatever is threatening you at that moment. Cleansing Nova is next. 3 mana to either destroy all creatures or all artifacts and enchantments. Since we're not going to be running too many artifacts or enchantments, one of our biggest things would be getting rid of all artifacts and enchantments off Cleansing Nova, but if our opponents are getting kind of scary, we can also destroy all creatures as well. And to boot, if we're holding up something like Eerie Interlude or even Lazel's Acrobatics, we can hold priority to cast those as well and destroy all creatures. That way all our opponent's creatures are dead and we get to basically blink all our creatures back into play. Devastation Tide is next, and I want to play with a couple of the miracle cards in this deck, as Aminatou allows you to put cards from your hand on top of your library. So whenever you get to draw a miracle card, you get paid for a lower cost. But with Devastation Tide, you return all non-land permanents to their owner's hand. With this, as I mentioned before, you can even flicker him with Lazel's Acrobatics or Eerie Interlude, but you can return all your non-land permanents to their owner's hand. That way, it's kind of like a full board Cyclonic Rift. It affects you as well, but if you actually do that and hold priority to cast one of the two spells I named just before, you have the ability to start your next turn with a full board over your opponents having to rebuild everything. Next up is Diabolic Tutor, our only tutor in the deck for 4 mana, one of the cheapest options and one of the most consistent boot tutors in our budget format, where for 4 mana you search your library for a card and then put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. Portent is next, a 1 blue mana sorcery that allows you to look at the top 3 cards of your target player's library. Not just you, it could be any one of your opponents, and then put them back in any order, and you can have that player shuffle their library if they want. And then also you get to draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. So you could even rearrange the top 3 of your deck. That way you rearrange them to what you want to do. It's also kind of in the same vein as Sensei's Divining Top, but you also have the ability to draw at the next upkeep, which is really amazing, especially for 1 mana. Terminus is next, and to the same vein as Devastation Tide, you can also put this back to Miracle It for 1 mana instead of paying 6, where with this you put all creatures on the bottom of their owner's library. This doesn't exactly get rid of all the creatures, and your opponents can also just put their commanders in the command zone to just play them at another point in time. But having an entire board just go away for 1 mana is just absolutely amazing. And last of our sorceries is Time Wipe. With this, you return a creature you control to its owner's hand, then destroy all creatures. Again, like a copy paste with what I said with Eerie Interlude and Lazel's Acrobatics, but you can basically just return 1 creature, blink, or you could hold priority to blink all your creatures and then wipe the board and have them all come back into play at the next end step. All our sorceries are basically just board wipes and for us to control the field in a way that we see fit. Our next category is our artifacts. We're only running 6 artifacts in this deck, but for the most part, they are just going to allow us to get to play a lot more of our cards. First, starting off with Hedron Archive, 4 mana artifact that allows you to tap for 2 colorless, and then 2 colorless, tap it and sacrifice the archive to draw 2 cards. Mind Stone is the same, but for a lesser amount. 2 mana to cast it, taps for 1 colorless, 1 colorless, tap and sack the Mind Stone to draw 1 card. Seer's Lantern is next, 3 mana for it to tap for 1 mana, but for 2 and tap you get to scry 1. So with this allows you to just scry and look at the top card of your library. If you don't like it, you can just scry it away, and then the next turn you get to draw what's underneath it. Soul Ring is next. It's the staple in any commander deck. 1 mana for an artifact that taps for 2 colorless. Staff of Nin is next, 6 mana that allows you to draw an extra card at your next upkeep and to tap it to deal 1 damage to any target. So even if you're just whittling down your opponent's tokens or just your opponent's life, that's all fun and games, but that extra card draw is where it's at. Last of our artifacts is Wayfarer's Bauble. 1 mana for an artifact to 2, tap it and sacrifice it, search your library for a basic land, put that card to the battlefield, tap, and then shuffle your library. We're coming down to the last 3 categories of our deck, and starting off with our enchantments. We're only running 3 enchantments, but let's get straight into it with Active Authority. Now, Active Authority is a 3 mana enchantment where when it enters the battlefield, you can exile a target artifact or enchantment, and then at the beginning of your upkeep, you can exile a target artifact or enchantment, and if you do, its controller gains control of Active Authority. The reason I'm adding this in is because of Aminatou. Aminatou allows you to exile another target permanent and blink it instead of just a creature. So you can keep blinking the Active Authority and keep exiling your opponent's artifacts and enchantments, which is actually hilarious. And for the fact that like you can also just constantly blink this and keep bouncing it, you're going to be rendering your opponents without any artifacts or any enchantments, especially hurting any artifact or enchantment focused decks. Elspeth Conquers Death is next. This is the only saga we're running in this deck, but with this, the first one is to exile a target permanent an opponent controls with converted mana cost 3 or greater, which for 5 mana is amazing. Its second is non-creature spells you control cast cost 2 more to cast until your next turn, which is a bit of a bummer, but for the fact that we're casting a lot of creatures in the deck, it's not the biggest issue for us. Its last set lore is to return target creature or planeswalker card from your graveyard to the battlefield and put either a +1/+1 counter or a loyalty counter on it. Obviously, you're going to be doing it for the exile target permanent an opponent controls because it's absolutely amazing and it can get you out of a sticky situation. The second lore is a little bit tricky as this kind of messes up with your instant speed interaction because you have to pay 2 more for any of your blink abilities. But the third ability, if you have a creature in your graveyard or if you decide to put Aminatou the Fateshifter into your graveyard, you could actually just get him back with an additional +1/+1 counter or loyalty counter on top of them. And lastly, we're running out of time in this deck. And out of time reads when it enters the battlefield, you untap all creatures and then phase them out until this leaves the battlefield. You put a time counter on this for each creature phased out this way. And it has vanishing, so you basically remove a time counter from it, and depending on how many creatures you exile with this, it may have multiple time counters. But when the last one is removed, you sacrifice this and all the creatures come back on the field. But as I mentioned before with Active Authority, Aminatou also can exile permanents. So out of time can also just exile and then come back into play, and the fact that you basically just get to do it over and over again. Our penultimate category is our one and only Planeswalker. Let's just go straight into it. It's Ob Nixilis Reignited. 5 mana for a Planeswalker with 5 loyalty. Basically, its +1 loyalty is to draw a card and lose a life. -3, destroy target creature. And -8, the ultimate is target opponent gets an emblem with whenever a player draws a card, you lose 2 life. So that emblem is where you want to get to because this completely screws over one of your opponents. Although it does make you the enemy for the rest of the game with them, it basically allows you to further kill your opponent immediately, where you could draw extra cards and destroy creatures with the other 2 loyalty abilities. The last category we're getting into is our lands. This is the fuel that drives our engine, and this is the necessary resources we need in order to play all of the cards that I've mentioned to you before. So let's get into it with starting off with Arcane Sanctum. This is the only land that taps for all 3 of our colors. It does come into play tapped, which is a bit of a bummer, but access to all 3 of our colors is amazing as it gets to fix us for whatever color we're missing. Ash Barrens is next. It can come into play either as a colorless land, or you can basic land cycle it to search for your land for a basic land and then put it into your hand and just filter out whatever you're missing in terms of colors. Command Tower allows you to tap for any color in your commander's color identity, again fixing you the same way Arcane Sanctum would, but this does not come into play untapped. Esper Panorama, again, like Ash Barrens, but a little different. It comes into play initially as a colorless land, but for 1 generic, tap it and sacrifice the Panorama. You get to search your library for either a plains, island, or swap and put it into the battlefield, tap, and then shuffle. Again, filtering out and fixing you for whatever color you're missing. Isolated Watchtower is next. This is the most expensive one of our lands as it comes into play as a colorless land, but for 2, tap, you get to scry 1 and then you reveal the top card of your library. If a basic land is revealed this way, you put it on the battlefield tapped, and you can only activate this ability only if an opponent controls at least 2 more lands than you do. In the color combination that we have, it's not going to be very difficult, especially for playing against a green deck, for them to have more lands than us. And especially so, that extra ability for our basic lands to come into play immediately after using the Watchtower is going to be significant, especially if we're using this at the end of turn. That way our lands will untap on our turn and we get to use them almost immediately. Mirrored Landscape is next, and sing this along with me if you know this. Mirrored Landscape enters the battlefield tapped. Tap it for 1 colorless, then 2 tap and sacrifice the landscape to search your library for up to 2 basic land cards that share land type. Put them onto the battlefield tap and then shuffle your library. Obscura Storefront is next. This is a new land coming out of New Capenna, where when this enters the battlefield, you sacrifice the land. When you do, you search your library for a basic plains, island, or swamp, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle your library, and then you gain 1 life. Extremely similar to the Esper Panorama, but this just comes into play and immediately sacks itself. And basically you get your whatever land you're missing in that case, and gaining an extra life. Temple of the False God is next, allowing us to tap for 2 colorless mana, and then you can only activate this if you control 5 or more lands. And lastly, we're running 9 islands, 10 plains, and 8 swamps. And that's how you make a blinking baby child. With our deck total of $50, which includes the price of the commander and excludes the price of the basic lands, we come to a deck total today of $52.44, which is still technically under budget, but with the implied overage compromise. So you can still build this deck with an extra $2.50 attributed to it, and as you see with a lot of the creatures that you have access to in this deck, you have a number of ways just to flicker them, ETB, and mess around with your opponents, or get yourself some extra value along the way. And with these decks, this is just the template of how you can create an Aminatou deck. Now you can take this in any way you like. Blink is not the only way you can take Aminatou. I decided to focus more on the Blink strategy since Blink is a really popular theme in Magic. So I decided to take one of the more popular themes and attribute it to Aminatou. But like I mentioned before, you have a myriad of ways you can take Aminatou. Done with that, let's take a look at some pros and cons of the deck and some out of budget recommendations. So let's get into our pros and cons now. Starting off with our pros, the very first pro is that it's a very reactive deck. Considering the amount of instants and creatures that we're running, especially the amount of Blink that we're running in this deck, it's easy enough to say that this is a super reactive deck, and the fact that you have a myriad of abilities to interact with your opponents, and most of it is just functioning as just abilities off of creatures that just come into the battlefield. This is just going to be super reactive. It's going to be something that your opponents actually obviously will see coming, but this will be just super synergistic with your deck. Also, it's very easy to respond to your opponents, very in the same vein as it being a very reactive deck, and not to sound like a broken record here, but for the fact that we're running 20 instant cards in this deck, which is about a fifth of our deck itself, we have a lot of ways to interact with our opponents, whether it be counterspells or just blinking our creatures to interact with our opponent's boards in any way, shape, or form. And for the fact that we have ways to just control the board with board wipes, and with the fact that we can avoid board wipes with two of our cards, it's gonna be sweetness for you and just a lot of sour notes for our opponents. The last of which is that it can get a lot of value off of blinking. So, considering the amount of blink effects we have in our deck with Aminatou, with Brago's attack, with Miss Meadow Witch, and with even Soul Herder as well at the end step blinking stuff, we have multiple ways of just getting our creatures to blink, come back into play, and then just using their enter the battlefield abilities to gain us some extra value on top of it. Now, some of our cons, and obviously I alluded to this before, but this deck is not a very ramp-friendly color combination. Esper does have a lot of problems when it comes to ramping, and especially so, only now are we seeing a lot more investment in white when it comes to cards that will allow you to ramp and get some extra card draw, but for the fact that we are relying on two creatures and other cards to fetch us the lands that we need, it's going to be very limited, and we don't even have mana rocks that'll tap for our actual colors. So this gives us a little bit of limitation in terms of what we can do. That, and we have a limited amount of counterspells. As this deck is primarily focused on blinking, we're only running 4 counterspells, so we have a very limited range when it comes to interacting with our opponents when we need to counter something that's really big or really important. Lastly, and I could not stress this enough, especially in game testing, it's not a very consistent deck between games. As this deck, considering the amount of creatures we run in this, considering the amount of instants we're running in this as well, the fact that it's not a very consistent deck in terms of winning and in terms of progressing your boards, it does lend itself to kind of awkward gameplay, especially against opponents. But for the fact that we're making this deck for fun, and for the fact that this deck is also very meme worthy, especially the fact that you can just blink your creatures and then at some point combo off with the Felidar Guardian and Corpse Knight combo. It's just funny all in all together. And if that fails, you also have Approach of the Second Sun as a secondary win con. Now let's get into our out of budget recommendations. So as you saw, we built this deck for roughly around $50, but we're adding 4 cards in here as suggestions for you guys. If you wanted to make this deck and take it to the next step, I have 4 suggestions for you, starting off with the Splacer Kitten. With Displacer Kitten, this allows you to, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you exile up to one target non-land permanent you control and then return that card to the battlefield under your control. So, whenever you're casting any one of our non-creatures, whether it be an instant, artifact, enchantment, planeswalker, or sorcery, you get to bounce one of your creatures, or another permanent, I should say, and then return to the battlefield. And so this will just kick off the synergies with, especially with Aminatou, especially with any one of our enter the battlefield abilities as well, because you can blink any one of our creatures and you can blink any one of our planeswalkers as well. Next up is Spark Double. So, namely speaking, Spark Double can go infinite with Aminatou, but we also don't have the other card in this deck. But for the fact that Spark Double can just come into play as a copy of a creature or a planeswalker, and it enters with additional +1/+1 counter on it or a loyalty ability, and it's not legendary too. So you can even copy Aminatou and get some extra blinking effects off it. So you can blink twice per turn, and you can value off it with 2 Aminatous on the field. Thassa Deep Dwelling is next, and this is our indestructible god that we're going to be praying to in this deck for as long as it has less than 5 blue devotion. It's not a creature, but at the beginning of your end step, you get to exile up to one other target creature you control and then return that card to the battlefield under your control. With that, we have another way of blinking our creatures, and with one of our permanents that are indestructible, it's going to be very hard to interact with Thassa, especially if they're not a creature. The last one is Conjurer's Closet. You've kind of figured it was going to be Conjurer's Closet, as considering we already had Soul Herder in here. At the beginning of your end step, you may exile target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under your control. Same thing as Soul Herder. It's the better Soul Herder, in my personal opinion, but for the fact that basically you have an extra engine to blink your creatures at the end step, and then for them to come into play and use their end of the battlefield ability is just sweet. And for the fact that you have a myriad, all these ways of just interacting with your end of the battlefield abilities. If you are somebody who does like controlling the field and who does like a lot of blink effects, I think this deck would be for you. And keep in mind, this is a template for the deck that you might want to build down the line. So if you do end up building this deck, let me know. I'd love to hear what your games turn out to be like. And that's going to do it for us today here. Thank you very much for watching this video. I truly appreciate it. And if you want to support the channel, by all means, just give this video a like, share it amongst your playgroups and your friends along the way. Subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon, because not only would I appreciate it, but this will also help the channel grow and get more people and more people who are very interested in Magic the Gathering deck brews along to the channel. So please share it amongst your friends. And if you want to reach out to me and if you want to follow my socials, I have my list in the bottom left-hand side of all my social medias, which includes my Twitter page, my Instagram, and my Facebook page. I'm actually becoming a lot more active on Twitter and on Instagram as well, so feel free to reach out for me there, And also, if you have any suggestions for newer videos, whether it be another deck brew, whether it be a general discussion video, or whether it be a gameplay video that you'd like us to do in the future, feel free to reach me out in one of my socials, and I'd be more than happy to accommodate and see what we can do from there. Last bit of business before I leave. Normally I post every second week. This is, like I said, just in previous videos, this is just a temporary thing. Next week I'll be posting a new video, and then I'll take a 2-week repose before I return to weekly posting. Today, the 22nd, next week, the 29th, and then the first 2 weeks of August, I will not be posting. So the first video I'll be posting that'll go back to a weekly schedule will be on August the 19th. So I look forward to seeing you guys there, and I'm looking forward to getting back on a more consistent schedule. But with that, thank you very much, and very truly appreciate the fact that you've made it this far into the video. No more words without sounding a broken record can attribute to how much I really appreciate it. So thank you guys, and I'll see you guys next week. But until then, cheers everybody.